Story 1 Matinicus Rock Lighthouse.
Nate, a Coast Guard veteran known for his honesty and practicality. Nate isn't one to lie or make things up. He's a grounded, non-superstitious guy who prefers boats in order to horror. In the summer of 2022, Nate recounted a story so disquieting that the narrator asked him to repeat it multiple times, and the details remained consistent. This tale unfolded in 2017, when Nate was assigned a 2-week maintenance rotation at Matinicus Rock Lighthouse off the coast of Maine. This remote location is only accessible by boat or helicopter. The lighthouse stands on a jagged, rocky island with a single auxiliary building for fuel and equipment. There's no power grid, no plumbing, and barely any cell signal. Though automated, the lighthouse requires occasional manual upkeep, prompting the Coast Guard to send personnel every year or so, typically a solo assignment. Strange electrical failures the previous year led them to send 2 people for this trip, Nate and a man named Russell. The first few days were uneventful, albeit windy, boring, and repetitive. By day, they'd check the beacon mechanics, test emergency batteries, refill the diesel generator, and scrape salt corrosion from the metal interior. At night, they'd read, eat simple meals, and play cards to pass the time. The isolation was expected, and there were no red flags. However, on the 4th night, Nate awoke around 2 a.m. feeling peculiar, not sick or in pain, but as if something was off with the atmosphere. The air was unusually heavy, like standing in a room just before a thunderstorm, even though the sky outside was clear and silent. He sat up and looked around in the dark. Then he noticed something. The beacon wasn't rotating. The lighthouse was supposed to emit a sweeping light beam every few seconds. Even during maintenance, a failed light was a major issue. Nate quickly roused Russell, and they ascended the narrow spiral staircase to the top of the tower to investigate. There, they found the gears that rotated the beacon were still moving, but the light itself wasn't turning. Something was jammed in the mechanism. A large, dark piece of cloth, like a blanket or old coat, wedged deep within the gear assembly. It was soaked, covered in a slimy, mossy substance, and smelled of rotting seaweed and mildew. Both were confused. The door had been locked, and the windows sealed. No wind or birds could have carried it in. It made no sense. They removed the fabric, tossed it outside into the wind, and went back to bed, assuming it was a bizarre, one-off incident. The very next night, the exact same thing happened again. Around the same time, just after 2 a.m., Nate woke to the beacon not turning. They went up and found another piece of cloth jammed into the same mechanism. Only this time, it wasn't the same type of fabric. It was smaller, resembling an old-fashioned scarf or shawl. It was red, frayed at the edges, and soaked through with what looked like ocean water. It even had tiny crustaceans clinging to it, as if freshly pulled from the sea. Nate said that was the moment things stopped feeling coincidental. They checked the doors, windows, and supply closet, but everything was secure. Now, they began to wonder if someone was messing with them, or worse, if something had gotten into the lighthouse and was deliberately trying to sabotage the light. From that night on, they started blocking the stairwell with heavy crates. After their final check upstairs, they religiously locked the beacon room and the bottom entrance. But on the 7th night, something occurred that Nate still refuses to explain. He was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when he heard Russell whispering from across the room. But he wasn't talking to Nate. He was murmuring to the corner of the room, saying strange, disconnected things, as if someone was standing there. Nate sat up and asked what he was saying. Russell blinked slowly, looking confused. He told Nate he hadn't said anything. But later that night, Nate awoke again, and found Russell sitting at the window, staring down at the rocks below. When asked what he was doing, Russell said he thought he'd seen someone standing down there on the rocks the night before, barely visible at the edge of the beacon's light. He said it looked like someone was watching them, and then disappeared when the light rotated back. After that, things began to spiral. Russell grew weirder every day. He stopped sleeping, spoke little, and just stared out the window for hours. Nate asked if he was okay, and Russell would only mutter about noises in the wall or hearing voices from inside the stairwell. On the 9th night, they both heard footsteps on the stairs, not the usual creaking from the wind, but real, slow, deliberate footsteps, one after the other, descending from the beacon room above. Nate looked over and saw Russell standing at the bottom of the stairs, frozen and staring up. He asked if Russell had gone up there, and Russell just looked at him and said no. Then he asked if Nate had. Neither of them had moved. They stood there listening, but the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. That night, They shoved a dresser in front of the bedroom door and slept with knives under their pillows. On the 11th night, they were woken again by the beacon failing. This time, when they reached the top of the lighthouse, the beacon room door was wide open. Not just unlocked, not just cracked open, but completely swung open, as if someone had kicked it in. The wind howled through, and when they got inside, the beacon wasn't just stopped, it had been deliberately tampered with. The bulb was unscrewed and placed upright in the middle of the room. That thing is in. You can't just twist it off by hand without effort. Nate stared at it, terrified, while Russell kept muttering that someone had done it. Then Nate felt something brush against his back. Something cold. He spun around, but no one was there. Russell had gone pale. He just kept pointing at the wall, whispering that he saw a hand come out of the bricks. They ran back down the stairs and locked themselves in the bedroom. Nate didn't sleep at all. Russell started rocking back and forth in the corner, whispering to someone who wasn't there. The next morning, Nate used the emergency sat phone and called for an early pickup, stating there had been a serious mechanical failure. The boat arrived that afternoon. But here's the creepiest part. When they arrived, the crew asked them about a distress call they had made at 2:12 a.m. that morning. But Nate had never made any call. He didn't touch the phone until daylight. The deckhand said they'd received a garbled call that came through as static, and a voice saying something about someone being there with them. Then it cut out. Russell didn't speak the entire ride back. He quit the Coast Guard a few months later, and never told anyone what truly happened out there. Nate still does maintenance duties sometimes, but he says he'll never, ever go back to Matinicus Rock.
Story to the Montauk Lighthouse adventure.
This story takes place during the COVID-19, a time when everyone was growing weary and restless from being cooped up indoors. The narrator, single at the time, spent his evenings swiping on dating apps and messaging people while binging movies and shows. What else was there to do on a weeknight during lockdown? He struck up a conversation with Sophia, a girl he'd been following on Instagram for years. They both lived in Suffolk County, Long Island, New York, about 20 to 30 minutes from the Hamptons, and an hour from One night, bored, they agreed to hang out. Conveniently, Soph lived only 5 minutes away, so he picked her up. They drove to a nearby park that was closed and drank hard seltzers there. The narrator immediately got a sense of her personality. A little rebellious, but in a cool way. She was up for hopping fences, trespassing, and similar adventures. A mutual connection formed quickly, and within an hour, she suggested driving out to Montauk and walking the cliff walk around the lighthouse. Technically, the lighthouse grounds were closed after sunset, and perhaps generally during lockdown. The narrator wasn't 100% sure, but he was immediately game for the adventure. They finished their drinks and drove all the way east to Montauk Point. Upon arrival, Soph told him to just park in the lighthouse parking lot. He was a bit hesitant, but she seemed confident there would be no security on a random Tuesday night during the off-season lockdown. Since he saw no other cars, he took her word for it. She mentioned she'd done this before, They parked and had another seltzer in the lot. He nervously glanced around occasionally, checking for security vehicles, while she told him to relax. Eventually, they started walking towards the lighthouse. Seeing a lighthouse up close at night and simply staring up at it was cool, yet also a bit eerie. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was something almost liminal about it. Soph led the way, taking a route slightly off the main entrance to avoid walking directly into the light and potentially exposing themselves. This was his first time ever at the Montauk Lighthouse. She guided them straight to the cliffside behind the lighthouse, where a series of rocks formed a trail called the cliff walk. They navigated solely by flashlight. Perhaps there was supposed to be lights down there, but that night, most everything was off except for a few lights by the front entrance and, of course, the lighthouse beam itself. As they began making their way along the cliff walk, mindful of their steps, Soph, now walking behind him, called his name. He turned to her, and she was pointing her light behind her, illuminating someone else behind them, also on the rocks. With both of their lights shining, it was easier to make him out. He wore a coat with a hood over his head. He appeared to be a black man, but they couldn't discern his age or any other details. The narrator called out, asking if he worked there, but the man didn't answer and didn't move. The narrator followed up with, "We're going to leave." Sorry. He was mostly nervous. It was a security guard and they'd get in trouble. Then, the man spoke. "Y'all want to buy some coke?" Discovering he wasn't a security guard but simply a random guy was no relief at all. If anything, it was more why was this creepy guy following them? Why was he even here? The narrator said, "No man, we're good," and motioned for Soph to keep moving. He let her go in front, and they pressed forward. As they walked along, The man started moving too. He didn't follow up with you, sure. He remained silent but seemed to match their pace. Sophie, the narrator, would glance back with their lights every so often, and he'd be the same distance away. It was the strangest, most uncomfortable thing, making the rest of the experience as tense as could be. They reached the end of the cliff walk and hurried through the grass back to the car. The guy from before was still following, basically matching their speed. They heard him call something over to them. It sounded like, "Where are you going?" This guy was obviously looking for trouble. The narrator didn't want to instigate anything, so he didn't respond, and he told Soph not to either. They walked side by side quickly to the car. That's when they noticed two more guys walking over from behind them as well. The narrator didn't want to run because that would definitely lead to them chasing. One of the other guys called something over too, though the narrator didn't hear what it was. They got to the car and hurried inside, and Soph and the narrator screamed when they both realized the three guys were right on top of the car now. The narrator locked the car immediately, swearing it was only seconds before two of them tried opening different doors. He put the car in reverse, basically the only direction where he wouldn't hit any of them. They kicked and hit his car as he reversed out, but they didn't bother chasing once the car was in motion. On the ride back, both their hearts were racing, and after the adrenaline wore off, they were both quiet. They called it a night after he dropped her off. They ended up hanging out many times after that and are still in touch today. But honestly, that night still unsettles the narrator. He was too close for comfort to something bad happening. His friends think it was a gang, maybe Crips, whatever it was. He has no interest in going back out there at night.
Story 3: The Decommissioned Lighthouse Inspection.
The narrator, Gregory, shares a story often told by his old friend, Ian. This unsettling tale happened many years ago, and Ian recently provided a detailed written version, giving Gregory permission to share it online. Ian was the kind of man you only needed to meet once to know he was the real deal. In his 50s, solidly built, with weathered skin from decades of working in saltwater air. He specialized in marine salvage and coastal infrastructure. Essentially, if something broke near the water, Ian was one of the people you'd call to fix it. But he wasn't just a contractor. He'd been a diver, a ship technician, and even spent time doing remote inspections for the government. The man had seen just about everything. So, when he told Gregory this story, there was no doubt in Gregory's mind. Ian said it happened in 2013 when he was hired by a small county in Washington state to conduct a structural inspection of an old, decommissioned lighthouse. The county had inherited the property years earlier and didn't know what to do with it. Developers wanted to tear it down. Historians wanted to preserve it, and no one wanted to pay for either. So Ian's job was simple. Go there alone, assess the place inside and out, and determine if it was even safe to restore. The lighthouse was on a remote rocky island about an hour off the mainland. Not a large island, just a hunk of stone and dirt, maybe 300 feet wide, with nothing but the lighthouse itself, a generator shed, and some rusted-out old scaffolding from decades past. The place hadn't been used in years and certainly wasn't a tourist destination. There weren't even any docks, just a small ledge where a Coast Guard boat could offload someone at high tide. Ian packed light, food for 4 days, a sleeping bag, some tools, a clipboard, and a 2-way marine radio. The plan was simple. He'd be dropped off Monday morning, complete a full walkthrough by Wednesday, and call for pickup Thursday afternoon. He didn't think twice about going alone, having done this sort of thing dozens of times before. When he first arrived, the place was quiet, cold, and cloudy, but calm. The air carried that usual mix of salt, metal, and decay you'd expect from something abandoned for decades. The lighthouse itself was tall, perhaps 50 feet. Built in the early 1900s, it featured the classic spiral staircase inside, leading up to the beacon room. That glass lens hadn't worked in decades, but the structure itself was solid. Ian performed his usual safety checks: support beams, stair integrity, window fittings. The floorboards on the lower level were warped but walkable. The second floor was an empty storage room except for some rusted metal cabinets. The third floor contained a tiny sleeping quarter unused for decades. He ended up laying his sleeping bag on the ground floor near the generator room, where it was warmer and out of the wind. The first night was uneventful. It was quiet, almost too quiet, Ian remarked. You don't realize how noisy the world usually is until it isn't. There were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of waves slapping against the rocks outside, just wind, and even that was soft. On the second day, thick fog rolled in. Ian woke to a completely white world outside. Visibility was limited to no more than 5 feet beyond the window. He described it as unlike any fog he'd seen before. It was so dense, it looked solid, like a wall, but he didn't think much of it, as the area frequently experienced heavy fog. He spent most of the day taking notes on the upper stairwell. That's when he noticed the first strange thing. Halfway up the staircase to the beacon room, there was a maintenance closet built into the wall. He'd tried to open it on day one, but the hinges were so corroded it wouldn't budge. But now, it was open a crack. Not much, maybe an inch, but enough to tell it had been moved. He figured the moisture in the air had caused it to shift, but he didn't like it. The inside of the closet was pitch black, and when he pushed the door wider, he saw something sitting in the back corner. A wooden box, perhaps the size of a lunchbox, covered in damp moss, as if it had recently been underwater. He didn't open it. He just shut the door again and made a note to report it. That night, something woke him up. He said it wasn't a sound exactly, but more the absence of sound, as if everything had stopped. And then he heard footsteps on the metal stairs above him. At first, he thought an animal had gotten inside, but then he realized they weren't descending. The steps were going upward. Whatever was in the tower was climbing. He turned on his flashlight and stared at the stairwell entrance, waiting. But nothing happened. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the silence returned. The next day, he searched the whole place, top to bottom. He checked every room and every closet. He even climbed onto the roof. But there was nothing, no animals or anything out of the ordinary except that box. It was now sitting outside the closet, halfway into the stairwell, still covered in moss. He said he stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, he picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. The wood was bloated with moisture, but the lid didn't open. It was nailed shut. He didn't want to mess with it too much, so he left it at the base of the stairs and went outside for air. That's when he noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt around the lighthouse. Bare footprints, not boots or shoes, but wet bare feet leading from the north side of the building, toward the cliff edge, and then stopping. The footprints didn't circle back. They were just 10 or 12 barefoot impressions in the mud that ended at a sheer drop into the sea. He said he stood there for a long time, trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had come ashore, but the only scheduled boat was his return ride, and that wasn't for another day. He considered using the radio to call for an early pickup, but the fog was so thick by then that they probably wouldn't even be able to navigate back. He went inside and locked every door and hatch. Then he wedged the stairwell shut with an iron pipe and tried to sleep. That night was worse. Around 1:30 a.m., he heard the door to the upper beacon room slam shut violently. He said the force shook dust loose from the ceiling. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks on the inside wall of the tower. Not the front door or window, but the wall itself. Like someone standing just inches behind the plaster, tapping their knuckles against the brick. Ian didn't move. He lay there frozen until the sound stopped. When the sun came up, he checked everything again. The box was gone, and the closet door was fully open. At this point, it was abundantly clear he wasn't alone there, so Ian used the radio and called for immediate extraction. The fog was still heavy, but he told them it was a medical issue. They said they'd tried to get a boat there within a few hours. He packed everything and waited by the landing ledge. The fog didn't clear. In fact, it apparently got thicker. He sat there for nearly 7 hours, unable to see anything more than a few feet in front of him. The sun was going down, and the air had gotten cold. He heard someone walking behind him in the gravel near the base of the lighthouse. But when he turned around, there was no one there, or he simply couldn't see who it was through the fog. He ran to the edge of the cliff and stayed there until he heard the boat horn in the distance. They pulled him out just after dark. The deckhand who helped him on board asked why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ian told him that the lighthouse was unsafe and should be sealed off. He filed a brief report back at the office, stating the structure was compromised and not fit for entry. But he never mentioned the footsteps or the box. He told Gregory he didn't, because he genuinely considered the possibility that he was simply losing his mind in isolation. This marks the end of what Ian sent Gregory in writing. Ian never went back to that lighthouse. He wrapped up his remaining projects that year and quietly phased himself out of fieldwork. Within a year, he stopped taking contracts altogether, saying he wanted to focus on dry land from then on. When Gregory asked if it was because of the lighthouse, he just shrugged and said he'd seen enough out there. Gregory pressed him once, just once, about what he really thought happened on that island. Ian looked him dead in the eye and said something that has stuck with Gregory ever since. Some places are meant to be left alone. They just need time and silence. That was all he'd say. Gregory tried to look into the lighthouse himself a while back, but he couldn't find much. The coordinates Ian had scribbled in his notes don't point to any listed structure. County records mention a decommissioned tower somewhere off the coast, but there's no official name and no accessible history. It's like he was never really there in the first place. And that's the part that unsettles Gregory most. Not what Ian said, but what nobody else ever did. Gregory doesn't honestly know whether he hopes Ian really was just, for whatever reason, going crazy on that island or not.